on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Mike Konczal. He's a fellow with the Roosevelt Institute. Mike, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back, man.
All right, so let's start. I want to do a quick. I want to talk just quickly touch on the Volcker Rule, and then get to your piece, and then we'll come back to the Volcker Rule if we have time. But the Volcker Rule was highly anticipated. It's been really, in some respects, 3 years in the making. Brought to us via Dodd-Frank. Nobody was sure what the nature of this rule was going to look like after the big London whale fiasco. It gained some steam. Just give me a quick letter assessment, a grade, if you will, as to where it came out. It was voted on Tuesday night, I guess. And what does it look like?
Well, I definitely give it at least a B plus, maybe even an A minus. I mean, it's a pretty solid rule. It's significantly better than where it was about a year or two ago when it was first starting to be floated out there in draft form. You have two different types of things to thank for the reason it came out so strong. One was, the group of liberal senators on the Finance Committee, Jeff Merkley, Elizabeth Warren, really pushed regulators to, really go back and rewrite the parts of the rules that didn't work, and also J.P. Morgan by the London whale trade. In 2012, they had a huge blow-up that showed that we really do need a strong rule at a point when a lot of people were trying to back away from the strongest implementation. Their screw-up really made the case for reform all over again after the crisis.
Well, then, Jamie Dimon has just got back on my Christmas card list, so I will send him a little picture of me and my family with a holiday greetings. All right. Well, so let's turn to and in some respects, I mean, I think what makes your piece about why liberals don't have their own Tea Party it's a really relevant question to ask at this stage. In some way, is implicated by the rise of this more progressive caucus in the Senate. Certainly, the nature of the Democratic caucus in the Senate has shifted now that we've gotten rid of folks like Lieberman et al. and see the the rise, the ascent of Elizabeth Warren. But so you write, why don't liberals have their own Tea Party? And you say it's because liberals have none of the three core traits that define the Tea Party. Walk us through those three core traits.
Sure. So one of the reasons I wrote this piece was in the aftermath of the shutdown. I saw a lot of people say, well, the Tea Party was able to shut down the government over trying to stop health care, and they're still going to probably get some concessions out of it. Now, it's not clear if they actually will end up getting anything out of that. The budget deal, certainly took unemployment off the table. But more the point is that a lot of people start talking about, well, they either had a very top-down or very bottom-up approach to what had gone, why there is no equivalent Tea Party on the left. Either they thought, it's President Obama is not being aggressive enough, he's not giving the right speeches or not putting troops in the field, or separately that groups like Occupy, for instance, were too horizontal and not focused enough on electoral politics, and so we lost there. And I thought, we really need to talk about this in a little bit more sophisticated way. What is it about the liberal coalition that prevents it from being able to form into a Tea Party? And what is it about movement infrastructure, between the two? What is it about the people? What is it about the money and the elites that really prevent a much more aggressive form of liberalism taking hold in Congress? And that's what I tried to explore in it.
Okay, and so you say, you say three core traits that define the Tea Party. One is that liberals don't have is they lack a hardline ideology. They don't have as strong of an infrastructure for building a successful movement. And their party's mainstream tends to ignore them rather than fear the more extreme elements on its side. Now, I want to dig into that a little bit, but I mean, here I went on Hayes' show the other night to sort of touch on this sort of question to a certain extent. And from my mind, what I think the primary sort of question that must be resolved before you wade into this type of thing is exactly what is the Tea Party? Because my opinion on this is that the Tea Party is, because, when one assesses whether or not the Tea Party has been successful, one has to sort of say, what is the Tea Party? To me, it is simply the electoral base of the Republican Party. I mean, I think there's been plenty now of academic studies saying this is the same fundamentalists, maybe, at least 50 some odd percent of the Tea Party are fundamentalists. This is basically the same 30% that said George Bush was still a great president on the day he left office. They were the only people who would say that. And this is just the base of the Republican Party. And any measurement of their success must be seen in terms of the Republican Party's larger agenda.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear. There are people who are more conservative than the average Republican. I mean, there are people who also crucially have a way of preventing the party from moderating or moving to the center on anything. Literally anything, through a system of congressional power brokers, through primary challenges, through media infrastructure network. I think people have become more conscious of it, and I think there's a sense in which people thought that the Tea Party might have been like, a brand new coalition that came out of the financial crisis or something, which quickly turned out to be false and is even more false nowadays than it was before. I mean, they're, very hard line against any kind of financial reform, for instance. So,
right.
When I look at it, I saw a lot of people say, well, why couldn't Occupy end up influencing Democrats the way the Tea Party influences Republicans? And from my point of view, and I always try to get this across to people, is that there's no way to plug in the same way there was for the right, because you had a lot of disgruntled people who all had a same kind of grievance, and then you had a lot of elite people with money who were willing to plug them into an infrastructure, yes, and use them in a way that Democrats would never do for their base.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bottom line to me is, the sort of the key difference here is that you have now the base of the party has taken over the party. It will prevent them, in my mind, from ever fielding a presidential nominee that can win in the next several cycles. But they will continue to have success, and I think they've had success because, yes, they didn't repeal Obamacare, but that is simply a tactic. I mean, when we came out of that whole budget crisis, for the left, or for the Democrats, or for, I guess, the country, victory was returning to the sequester, which of course is a massive fail. And so to me, the Tea Party and anything they ask for is just sort of tactical to push things to the right. And they've been successful, it seems to me, on virtually every click that you want to check off down the road. Give me your sense of that.
I mean, this is really tough because a lot depends on what happens in the next, 5 or 6 years. One thing that really scares me, and I didn't actually get this across well enough in the piece, one thing that really scares me about the Tea Party is that they've taken things that are actually like really radical attacks on government, like the Ryan Plan. And that's not just like, I'm obviously a partisan and an ideologue, but like the Ryan Plan is actually a really dramatic restructuring of the government away from providing support for the poor and towards really lowering taxes on the rich, and dismantling Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance. That is now such a consensus. It's almost like the moderate position in the Republican caucus, though it's like a radical position by any other means of understanding it. So, and crucially, they've been able to you see this a little bit with liberals, with, for instance, Elizabeth Warren and Social Security, and trying to increase it a little bit rather than cutting it. But it's just not even the same ballpark in terms of taking a really core ideological vision of what they want to do with the government and forcing everyone to sign it. And they do that in part because they have a base that's really ideologically aligned right now, and then they have elites who are willing to fund primary challenges and really push the ball very hard in that thing. Now, if the Republican caucus continues to lose elections, there's enough veto points in the government that they can stop reform. The question is if they take the government again, will they do this kind of radical thing? And that scares me, and I don't know.
But they also, the thing is that from theoretically a position of weakness, right? They have the House, they don't have the Senate, they don't have the presidency. I'm speaking in broad strokes here, but we're seeing sort of a response to what's happened with this crisis that doesn't seem to. In other words, we have. I mean, just look at the fact that we're not going to extend unemployment. It's almost unthinkable that we're basically just going to cast adrift 1.4 Americans, a million Americans. The notion of government hiring. We are behind still in the wake of this recession. We are somewhere around 2.1 million, just, vaguely speaking, in terms of an average of where we would be relative to President Reagan, President Clinton, both Bushes, in terms of government hiring, right? I mean, because we're 700,000 jobs less in the government sector, as opposed to increasing government employment by 1.1, 1.2, whatever it was with those four other presidents. And I think part of the reason is because of groups like Heritage. I think they because there's so much money now for these groups that don't have to be transactional in any way with the people they're lobbying, that all bets are off.
Yeah, and I mean, and Heritage will, for people who do not toe the line, there's huge primary challenges and huge pressure from the right in the way that there's literally nothing on the left. I mean, we have to remind your listeners of Bill Halter, if you remember that whole thing from 2010, which the administration, is a primary challenge against Blanche Lincoln from left, not a crazy left, but like, a solid step to the left. And, President Obama showed up and helped out the incumbent. There was like a really, there's just never, even with Joe Lieberman in 2006, then Senator Obama wouldn't even show up in the state. I mean,
That's
it was
right.
kind of, there's just never been that kind of pressure. I will say, I think, and this relates to the austerity, is that, the Tea Party's been crazy effective at the state and local level. They've radicalized a bunch of states. A lot of people are aware of it through the Medicaid lack of Medicaid expansion in a lot of these states. But things from reproductive rights to just basic like lunch breaks and like a minimum wage, the state level stuff is really effective, and that worries me a lot because I think they've taken a party that's was probably pretty right at the state level and now made them very radically right, and they're just really redoing these states. And that's going to continue because it's very hard to build footholds in new states.
I think the point of the state level is also sort of particularly difficult because, in that race, that Bill Halter race, there was a lot of union money that was spent. And I think you could see a union afford to spend that type of money in a race when you're talking about a senator, right? But in the context of states now, unions are so reliant on a transactional relationship with the Democratic Party that in some ways the costs, and I'm not talking about dollar costs, but the implications of supporting of a run, let's say, at a Democratic governor, or to pressure a Democratic governor, the Democratic governor always says, like, well, you want a Republican one? I mean, this is what we're starting to see. When we see the pension cuts in Illinois done by a Democrat, when you see this happening in Michigan, this in some way sort of prevents unions from exercising the same type of power that, let's say, a Heritage does or an AFP does, or all of these outside groups that get funded by billionaires, and they've got nothing to lose. I mean, they literally have nothing to lose by going too far or what we anticipate being too far.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also that in a broader sense, that's also one of the lack of homogeneity. Like, so when you think of the Tea Party, you can kind of sketch what they really want to accomplish, right? They really want to dismantle public support for the poor, or social insurance and privatization. On the Democratic side, especially at the state level, it's do they want stronger union protections for teachers? Some do, but many don't. Do they want the magic of the market to come flood into public schooling and, sell it all off wholesale to hedge funders or whatnot? There's some who do and some who don't. And so, and a lot of that is bad faith, but a lot of it's not. And so it's a real difference that makes it hard to then suddenly say, we're going to take a bunch of candidates and make them sign off on our agenda, because the agenda is incoherent or underdefined.
Right. And I'm not even convinced, though, that's the Tea Party agenda. I mean, I think that the Tea Party agenda is really still caught up in sort of more of the culture war than I think is given credit on a national level. I think that we hear about those other things because that's frankly the agenda of those who are funding, are funding the Tea Party. I mean, and I think there is if you were to sit down with the people who are expending the money and sit down with the people who are answering the emails, I think there would be a divergence there, but not so huge that one could make a huge story, but enough of a divergence to show that the Tea Party agenda has just been sort of, I think, a marketing a tool for the same sort of far right, I guess, influencers in the Republican Party, which I guess leads us to like what is the closest that liberals could get to that type of model in some level?
Well, I mean that's the big question. The question is, would it be helpful? I think there was a lot of optimism that the netroots could do this in large part through both, just kind of infrastructure and people. And I think certainly a lot of the original netroots people seem very down on the idea that that's going to pan through, and I think it's hard to imagine it. Labor unions, which traditionally provided that kind of role, are in serious decline, and there's a lot of good people trying hard to push back on that, but it seems unlikely that it's going to break through anytime soon. Even with some like card check or something, it's still hard to imagine we'll have the union density of the 50s or 60s. So I mean, I don't think there's actually a very encouraging sign. Now, on the other hand, things can still get done. I mean, we did. It's slower. It takes much longer. The filibuster on judicial nominees, but like non-executive. Part of the filibuster was rolled back in the Senate. That was a big move, and it took forever. They should have done it in 2009, but they eventually did it. So there are encouraging signs. The coalition is broader, so a lot of things are murkier, but there is the possibility of it. I'm not entirely encouraged. I'm more pessimistic than optimistic about the future, but I do think one thing I wonder is if the Tea Party looks a lot like liberalism did in the 70s, where they came very close to doing a lot of big things: a basic income, an equal rights amendment, a full employment act, like a genuine full employment act, but none of them passed. And I'm curious if that's how we'll see, Medicare voucherization or all the Ryan plan stuff.
But the thing is that I don't think that I mean, my sense is that not even those people who answer the emails for the Tea Party, they don't even subscribe to that. I mean, and to a certain extent, this is somewhat anecdotal, but I mean, there's certainly polling out there that shows this. But I went down to one of the Glenn Beck 912 rallies. Now, granted, this was 2 or 3 years ago, right, when ostensibly the Tea Party was even more about that notion of, and I interviewed on camera about 100 people, and I swear to you that I remember the one guy who told me, yes, he would cut Social Security and Medicare. The rest of them to a person had every reason in the book not to cut it. Well, it already exists. People are relying on it. That's not what I'm talking about. And the one guy who said it literally was like, look, I've got a bunker. And that's when the government went socialist, and I'm not going to say any more because I don't know who might be watching this video. I mean, literally, that was the one guy and who was against Social Security and Medicare, and so I'm not even convinced that's the agenda of that base. Let me ask you this: do you think? Are we reading too much into? I mean, this was very much a sort of an inside baseball, not even involving policy at this point, but this whole third way smackdown, which, frankly, to me, what the third way espouses, it's ostensibly a Democratic group, but what it espouses is really not dramatically different, if it's different at all, from what the the people who are supporting the Republican base, one of their agendas, right? I mean, to shrink entitlements. Is there something is there some, I guess, notion or some, I guess, outline, some paradigm to follow, some model in that tussle?
I mean, I think you can take it, issue to issue, and I think, the programs that work really well. I mean, they can be expanded, and people like them, and they want to see them expanded, and they understand the role they play. So, so the third way is like the perfect enemy to have when it comes for people who appreciate Social Security and want to see it expanded and want to see it not turned into a giant Wall Street mess. There's a big question about whether or not Obamacare, the core webpage part of it, will gather that kind of support of people who understand the role it plays, and it creates its own constituency that wants to see it do better. That's a really open question. It certainly hasn't happened yet. I don't know. I'm not optimistic about it. I do think it's tough to generalize conservatives. A lot of people say they're conservative, but they're not. They're operationally liberal. They're rhetorically conservative, I think is the phrase. So they do like Social Security. They do want to see schools that are good and helpful for communities. But when it comes to people who are strongly conservative versus strongly liberal, there's about twice as many. I think it's 5% versus 10%. 10% are strongly conservative. And I think you kind of see that. Like the mobilization's a little bit more aggressive, especially at the primary level. They're older, so they're a little bit more involved with politics. They have a little bit more money, so they can kind of do more with it. So, I mean, I still think that there is a base mobilization in addition to the more elite and the infrastructure level. I think people are trying to figure out post-Obama politics. I think so much of where politics right now came out of the Bush years, which was like an anyone but Bush. It was a big push to get health care at any cost, and now they're trying to figure out a model of how to do politics afterwards. People like PCCC and Elizabeth Warren, the people who've pushed the Social Security stuff, I think are a really good model. I'm curious how scalable it is, and I think that's one of the big questions.
Right. Well, I think that, in some ways, the PCCC is not unlike the same model as Heritage Action, right? I mean, insofar as they don't necessarily, although I think, it sounds to me like the PCCC has a little bit more of a working, well, I mean, I guess the Heritage does too with their folks, but I mean, they're willing to anger part of the Democratic caucus, and Heritage is clearly willing now to anger part of the Republican caucus, and in some respects, they're both untouchable. And, insofar as like the model, it seems to me on the left has been advocacy groups that have relationships in Washington, and they have been always afraid to burn those. And that has been part of their operating, their modus operandi. And on the right, they're not as afraid to burn those relationships because their funding and their relevance is sort of outside of the sphere of just basic access. And, the question is, there is no, George Soros just does not seem to be as loosey-goosey with his cash in the way that the Koch brothers are, and frankly, corporate America. And that, to me, seems like one of the biggest, still the biggest problems.
Yeah, I mean, PCCC does a lot of great work, but I mean, it's not at the scale of just the money isn't there in the same way it is for Americans for Prosperity. Or, Heritage is a $60 million a year operation and can probably draw more reserves if they needed to. CAP, I think, is approximately $30 million and much more closely aligned with key players in a way that, CAP is not like I really appreciate, I love the work Center for American Progress does, but they're not like a disciplining mechanism for centrist Democrats by any means.
Right.
And you need money, you need people, you need, this is the third part is that, it's an old line, but, the Republicans fear their base, but the Democrats don't like their base, right? Like, they're, the more polarized and the more ideological parts of it. And so, PCCC can pick a great fight on literally one of the strongest things we have, which is Social Security. I mean, but when it comes to other things that are slightly more polarized, like, for instance, schools, public schools, for instance, where the Democratic coalition's a lot more in different directions. I think they're going to have a harder time. I'm glad they're picking the fights on the stuff that we can definitely win and that also make a difference in people's lives, like Social Security. But it's hard. I mean, it's not quite there yet.
Right. We are still a couple of billionaires shy, I think, of pushing that. Mike Konczal from the Roosevelt Institute, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.